Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm with Jorge Marti. He is the Secretary of HENSA Venezuela. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, as always.
This has been an unusual year, perhaps for some. 2020 has been a year that has infused the population in many areas with great fear and, with good reason, perhaps. In many ways, it's been a challenging year for social movements, given the level of quarantine and mandatory distancing that has been imposed. How would you describe 2020?
Yes, it has been a very strange year, to be frank. And at the end of it, 2 million people have died from this pandemic. And a large part of these deaths could have been avoided if the different governments had taken the necessary measures. But this was coming into conflict with the logic of private profit, and the governments were wary of locking down and taking strict quarantine measures for fear of damaging the economy. And when they talk about the economy, they mean the profits of the private capitalist owners. So that's what's really marked the year 2020, the realization for many people that capitalism and public health are two contradictory interests, and that one goes against the other. On the other hand, we ended 2019 with some really big movements, including in Latin America. We saw the uprising in Ecuador in October 2019, which was then followed by the uprising in Chile 2019 in November and December, which was the largest in the country's history, I don't know, for 40 or 50 years, really. And this process, these movements were partially cut across by the development of a pandemic. Obviously, if people have to stay home or people have to follow social distancing rules, as you were mentioning, it's more difficult to organize mass movements, mass protests. But nevertheless, these movements have not ended, have not disappeared in 2020. I mean, we have seen the huge movement in the United States, Black Lives Matter, which involved 26 million people participated directly in demonstrations, protests against police killings and police racist violence. But also in Latin America, I mean, we have seen the uprising in Peru, when the Congress decided to remove Vizcarra from power, and then the masses came out on the streets, rejected the new appointed president, and there was a week of mass demonstrations. Then we saw in Guatemala big protests against the new budget of cuts and social austerity, which led to the setting on fire of the parliament building. And we've also seen movements in other places, even in Colombia, where they have a very right-wing president, which could be compared to Trump. There was, a few months ago, a big protest against police violence, again, after the police killed an innocent man in Bogota. And there were big protests, particularly by the youth, which led to clashes with the police, the killing of another 15 people at the hands of the forces of order, so-called, and the burning down of 40 police stations in Bogota. So I will say that, it's been a very strange year, which has been marked by COVID. But at the same time, I think that there's been a growing realization that the capitalist system is unable to deal with a health emergency. And also that now, on the back of COVID, although not caused by the pandemic, that there's now a massive capitalist crisis. Millions of people have lost their jobs. At the moment, the main governments around the world are spending a lot of money to try to prevent social explosion by giving relief to people who lost their jobs, trying to keep businesses afloat by government handouts. But this extraordinary, unprecedented government spending will come to an end at some point, and then we will see the real consequences of this new capitalist crisis, which is basically just a continuation of the crisis in 2008.
Now, can we talk a little bit about, the compounding impact of health in a neoliberal society where for the past 30 years, the tendency has been to cut on social safety networks, health, education, and the way that perhaps this pandemic has made visible the contradiction of capitalism and development.
Yes, I mean there's different angles to this, but they all point at the same question, that the capitalism is unable to stand up to a health emergency, but it's also unable to prepare for it because, as you say, in the last 10 years or perhaps even more, there's been a process of privatization of healthcare in those countries where they have a national health service, a state-owned health service system. And also massive budget cuts in healthcare and education, which have left health systems unprepared and in a much worse condition to face up with a health emergency like this. This has been one of the aspects of this COVID-19 emergency. The other one is obviously the way in which governments have responded to it from the point of view of, for instance, procurement of personal protective equipment for healthcare professionals and so on, which has been a complete disaster by going into private companies, awarding contracts without any scrutiny under the excuse of the emergency. For instance, here in Britain, it's calculated, there's a new report that's been issued. It says that half of all the money spent in health procurement during the pandemic have been awarded without any public scrutiny or tendering process. It's been awarded directly to people who had connections with government ministers or Tory politicians, government politicians. And this has led to massive corruption scandals, the awarding of massive bonuses to people who didn't do anything. And it just shows how capitalism is completely unprepared for a thing like this. At a time of a great national emergency, be it a health emergency like this or a natural disaster, it becomes completely clear that the free market is unable to allocate resources, is unable to respond quickly, it's completely inefficient. And that, on the contrary, a state-owned, centralized system is necessary to tell companies what they should produce, in which amounts, to which specifications, and that this should not be done in the interest of profit, but it should be done in the interest of public safety, if you want. And this, as I say, has been revealed in, systems like in Britain, where there's been a massive decrease in the last 20 years in the number of people who work in the health service. I think the number of nurses and doctors has gone down by 30%. The number of hospital beds has gone down by 20%. This is madness from the point of view of an everyday health situations, i.e. the winter months where there's more people in hospitals and so on. This was already a crisis before the pandemic, but obviously now faced with this massive unforeseen emergency, this has meant that the health service was much more unprepared to deal with it. And as a consequence, people have died. It's quite clear. Tens of thousands of people have died that could have been prevented. These deaths could have been prevented if there had been a different policy over the last 10 or 20 years of building up public services, including healthcare, education, transportation, and so on.
Can we talk a little bit about how this pandemic is also being used to stamp on social movements? Before 2020, we saw the uprising of the Yellow Jackets. In Europe, for instance, we saw the mass people in Bolivia fighting against a coup government. We've people heard of Hondurans fighting against, coup government that continues to be recognized by the U.S. and Canada. So how has this pandemic facilitated the funding of those, repressive governments to continue their oppression on their people?
Yes, of course. In the middle of the pandemic, imperialism has not ceased. We have seen things that are completely scandalous. For instance, the Venezuelan government, a long time ago, the Venezuelan central bank deposited part of its gold reserves in the Bank of England for safekeeping. And these reserves have now been seized by Britain, and they refuse to hand them back to Venezuela. So in the middle of the pandemic, the Venezuelan government made an offer to say that if these gold reserves, which are rightfully theirs, rightfully belong to Venezuela, were to be returned, they will be put in a separate fund under the scrutiny of the United Nations to be used only for expenditure related to fighting the pandemic, i.e. the importation of protective equipment, of ventilators for hospitals, the purchasing of vaccines and so on. And they still refused. The British government refused to do this. They're using, even in the middle of a pandemic, they're using instruments of imperialist aggression, in this case, the seizing of assets, regardless of the impact that this potentially has on ordinary people and the impact of the pandemic in a country like Venezuela. Or for instance, in the middle of the pandemic, obviously Cuba has been a country that's been badly affected. They have had to close down to international tourism, which is one of the main sources of income and so on. They have responded quite well considering the circumstances. But in the meantime, the U.S. government of Trump has increased sanctions against Venezuela with the aim of asphyxiating it economically. For instance, there's been like 3 or 4 different measures taken during 2020 against Cuba, but one of the most damaging is the one where they have prevented Western Union from operating in Cuba in the transfer of remittances from Cubans living and working in the U.S. to their families in Cuba, which was also a major source of income for the Cuban economy. Western Union is not allowed to operate anymore in Cuba, and remittances are either impossible or much more difficult. This is at a time when the country has no other source of income because it's been cut off because the stoppage of global transportation, tourism, and so on. This is really vindictive measures on the part of imperialism, which doesn't stop being imperialism, not even in the middle of a humanitarian crisis like this. At a time when, in fact, Cuba has been helping other countries around the world with medical brigades, with the development of drugs in order to treat COVID, and now even the development of vaccines in Cuba. There are 2 vaccines in the pipeline, homegrown, produced by the Cuban biomedical industry, which could be used very soon for the prevention of COVID-19. So yes, in reality, imperialism doesn't stop, not even in these conditions.
I guess the beauty of having to self-isolate or, distance is that you have a lot of time to contemplate what matters to me, what part is mine to do, and how do we engage with that, right? Whether it's the oceans that you care about, whether it's, poverty, housing, whether it's health, whether it's political justice and having democratic governments, whatever it is that really sparks your imagination, there is a way to engage with those movements. How do you keep yourself, motivated, and what excites you about this time we are living?
Yes, in fact, if you look around the situation in the world, there is very little to be optimistic about. But what can you do? This is the situation that we live in, and the only thing that you can do is try to understand why this is happening. Why? In the United States, the most powerful capitalist country in the world, over 400,000 people have died. In the UK, over 100,000, and similar numbers in other countries. In countries like Peru or Ecuador or Brazil, it's a complete disaster. and I wouldn't even trust the official figures for the results of this. So in the middle of all this, what do you do to keep yourself active and motivated? Well, it's just a question of understanding that unless and until we put an end to this system that is unjust, unfair, criminal even, that is based on private profit, then none of this will change. And obviously, in these conditions, more and more people realize that this is the case, and we need to play a role. We need to play a role in a collective manner. We need to engage with this in a collective, through collective action. And what's really inspiring is things like what's happening in Chile in the last 1 year. Mobilization, unprecedented mobilizations, more than 1 million people in Santiago. And this happened despite massive police repression, the killing of people at the hands of the forces of repression, be that the Carabineros police or the military, the curfew, and so on. And nevertheless, the people kept coming out, and until they achieved at least some of what they were demanding. They want a fundamental change of everything. In the United States, people have also said enough is enough. The killing of George Floyd was outrageous in itself, but it's not just the killing of George Floyd that brought 26 million people out on the street. It's the fact that this is not the first one, it won't be the last time that a black person is killed by the police in complete impunity just because of the color of his skin. So this is what's brought many people to say enough is enough. We need to put an end to this, and this is what should drive political activism. This alternative, which I would say is the alternative between socialism or barbarism, i.e., either we create a system which is based on the interests of the majority, the collective interests of the majority of the people, where the resources are used to satisfy the needs of the population rather than the thirst for private accumulation of a small minority. Unless we do that, then this is what we're faced with, really capitalist barbarism. But it is possible. I mean, the movements that have taken place in 2020 are inspiring. The Black Lives Matter was a movement that was in numbers even bigger than the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That's something. And it also shows you another side to the United States. You see on your television screens the Trump mob assaulting the Capitol. And yes, that happened, but you have to have a sense of proportion. The number of people who assaulted the Capitol were a small number of people. Even the people who were outside in the Trump demonstration, they couldn't have been more than 100,000, probably less. This pales into insignificance if you compare that to the masses of people who came out for the Black Lives Matter movement. These people are dangerous, the Trump supporters, but that doesn't mean that they are a majority or that they can rule the day. If we are many, we are many more than them. And if there was an organization in the United States based on working people, they will be able to cut across this polarization, which now takes place along completely reactionary lines. I mean, Trump has been able, partially, to capitalize on the anger that exists against the establishment, and he's channeled it in a completely reactionary direction. But that anger wasn't created by Trump. This disillusionment in bourgeois democracy wasn't created by Trump. It's been created by the fact, for instance, that real wages in the United States have been completely stagnant since the 1970s, while the rich become richer all the time. It's just a question of fighting to create an organization that represents the interests of working people that can channel all this anger in a progressive direction, rather than this reactionary mob that Trump has managed to whip up.
Can we talk a little bit about then what it signifies for us to have Joe Biden then? Because most people think, great, we won. And I'm cautiously aware that there is a very small difference between the two. So what must we, as social movements, as social justice people who want to create a world where everyone can coexist and have a right to live in peace and be able to raise children that don't fear pandemics or wars. What must be vigilant to in this next?
I would say this, that in reality, I can understand, I can sympathize with many people, millions of people in the United States who mobilized to vote in the presidential election. There was a marked increase in the turnout, particularly amongst the youth, and they wanted to get rid of Donald Trump. So they voted against Trump more than in favor of Biden. Biden is an establishment politician, is a capitalist politician, which is completely unable to enthuse anyone. Which policies did he defend during the campaign? None. After 4 years of reactionary demagogue in the White House like Trump, he was completely unable to clearly differentiate himself because the Democrats are a party of the capitalists. In this election, the Democrats received twice the amount of business corporate funding than the Republicans did. All the major capitalist newspapers in the United States were backing Biden. I mean, in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, what did Biden say? He said, well, we need to train the police to shoot at the legs instead of shoot people in the head. That is the amount of difference that there is between the two capitalist parties in the United States. That's very sad, and it's very regrettable. And obviously, while I fully understand and sympathize with people who went to vote and voted for Biden to kick out Trump, we need to warn that Biden is not the solution. That in fact, the policies of the Democrats in power is what then led to the formation of the Trump movement. People were disillusioned by the Democrats in power, and now the Democrats are in power, and they have control of the 3 seats of power. They have the president, they have the Congress, and they have the Senate. They have no excuse to carry out whatever progressive policies they want to carry out. And I can tell you that they will not. They will not fundamentally be different from the Republicans in power. This is a party of capital. The way they dealt with Bernie Sanders is a clear indication of that. And not only this, they will be the party of capital in power at a time when there is a massive crisis of capitalism, where the capitalists will be demanding massive austerity cuts, an assault on workers' rights. I don't think anything progressive will come from the Biden presidency, other than perhaps a few gestures, empty gestures, which cost no money at the beginning in order to appease many people who have illusions in the Democrats. In relation to foreign policy, we need to be really, really clear on this question. The foreign policy of the Democrats has not been ever different from the foreign policy of the Republicans. We need to remember, for instance, the current regime of sanctions against Venezuela was introduced in 2005 by Obama. Obama introduced an executive order that said that Venezuela is a danger to the national security of the United States. And on that basis, all the other sanctions have been imposed on top of that executive order. Perhaps there is one thing that we should be discussing is perhaps there will be a change of policy in relation to Cuba, where Biden might, it's not clear, but he might go back to the Obama policy. But what was the Obama policy in relation to Cuba? It's not that Obama was a friend of the Cuban Revolution. What he realized, and a section of the U.S. ruling class realized, is that the policy of direct assault against the Cuban Revolution, which they followed for 50, 60 years, had failed. And they wanted to try something else, i.e. try the reestablishment of relations, the reestablishment of economic relations, and on the basis of that, the penetration of capitalism in Cuba, which will destroy the revolution. So the difference is difference in tactics. The Democrats still want to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And I mean, we've had so many democratic governments before carrying out imperialist policies. You could say that Trump, for whatever reason, has not started any imperialist war. Has been a president which has not bombed many foreign countries as compared to previous democratic presidents. That doesn't mean that Trump is progressive, of course. he had a different approach to foreign policy. That's all, but still, it's the foreign policy of the capitalist class. So I have no hopes or illusions in Biden. All the statements by Biden prior to his assuming office, all the people he has already appointed, point in the direction of a continuation of imperialist policies of intervention in other countries. Perhaps some of the methods will change, but the aims will still be the same. The capitalists have paid for the Democrats to come to power. They will dictate the policies.
So how do we continuously seek out the immunity of community, which is the only thing that creates social movements, strength, and, contagion for social justice? When we look at the example of Venezuela and the people of Bolivia who have who have brought the mass party to power, when we look at the examples of Chile, how do we energize our social movements in Western countries, in Europe and in North America, with that kind of learned activism, because there's learned helplessness, right, where we get traumatized by loss of jobs, by constant aggression from the capitalist system. But there's also a learned activism, this idea of being in community, of moving together, of creating together, and continuously staying energized in our own immunity, which is really community, the community we co-create together.
Yeah, that's completely, absolutely right. I mean, one of the first things that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, when major capitalist countries declared lockdowns and so on, was that spontaneously people came together to help each other. Through mutual aid organizations, networks, WhatsApp groups, people checked on their neighbors. In some cases, neighbors they didn't even know. They checked whether they were frail, whether they were vulnerable, or they were shielding, whether they needed some help with people delivering groceries, shopping, or anything. And these networks this is the real human nature. Sometimes people say, human nature is against socialism or a socialist alternative. It's the opposite. People generally, in the face of a threat, they tend to band together. They tend to get together to try to solve and collectively face any danger or any difficult situation. And this is what's happened. The cooperation of people to solve problems collectively, and this is what happens every time when there is a major emergency like this, and this is what gives us hope that there is a collective solution. That despite the fact that capitalism promotes individualism and dog-eat-dog mentality, that people do gang together, they get organized, and they come out, and many times in unexpected ways, against the police, against looters, and so on. This is the real human nature, and this is what should motivate us. This is why we should remain optimistic in the face of all these different situations.
Thank you again for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement.